She bought a cheap farm with a water tower, thinking she would start her life over. But what she found inside led the FBI straight to her house. She hadn't been back to her parents' house in years, and now she couldn't cope without them. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. She had grown up on land that never pretended to be easy. The farm lay a few miles beyond the last paved road, where the fields widened and the horizon stopped offering promises. Mornings there began before light. The air carried the weight of soil and water, of animals breathing in their stalls, of wood that needed splitting, and fences that needed mending. As a child, she learned early that nothing on the farm waited for you to feel ready. Cows had to be milked, whether you were tired or not. Crops demanded attention whether the day felt kind or cruel. The land was patient, but it was never forgiving. Her parents were part of that land in ways she only understood much later. Her father moved through the farm with the quiet economy of someone who had long stopped arguing with necessity. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were measured and practical, shaped by years of fixing what could be fixed and enduring what could not. Her mother noticed everything. She knew when rain would come hours before the clouds gathered. She remembered which fence posts were beginning to rot and which fields needed rest. Love in their household was not loud. It was expressed through work done without complaint and presence that did not demand acknowledgement. As a child, she absorbed these lessons without question. She knew how to drive a tractor before she learned how to parallel park. She knew how to judge the health of a field by the feel of the soil in her hands. Yet even then, a quiet resistance lived inside her. The farm felt solid, but it also felt final. She watched her parents age in rhythm with the seasons, watched the same routines repeat year after year, and she feared that staying meant disappearing into that repetition. Beyond the fields, the world seemed larger, brighter, more forgiving of mistakes. In her imagination, the city was not a place so much as an answer. It was proof that she could become something other than what the land had shaped her to be. That longing grew sharper as she got older. She loved her parents, but she hated the way people spoke about farms like hers, as if they were symbols of failure rather than endurance. At school, when others talked about universities, careers, travel, she felt the unspoken weight of where she came from. The farm became something she defended fiercely and resented quietly at the same time. She promised herself that she would not remain where she had been born, not because she despised it, but because she feared what staying would mean for her sense of worth. When the moment to leave finally came, it did not arrive with drama. There was no argument, no slammed doors, no raised voices. She announced her decision one evening after dinner, her words rehearsed, but her voice steady. Her parents listened. Her father nodded once, as if acknowledging weather rather than a life-altering choice. Her mother asked practical questions about housing and work. They helped her pack. They loaded her belongings into the car. On the morning she left, her father hugged her briefly, his grip firm and unadorned. Her mother pressed a small envelope of emergency cash into her hand, not as a gesture of doubt, but of preparedness. They stood by the driveway and watched her drive away, not waving frantically, not calling after her, simply present. At the time, she interpreted their calm as distance. In the city, she told herself that they had let her go too easily, that perhaps they had been relieved. That thought made it easier not to call. It was simpler to believe that she had severed something cleanly rather than admit she had left something unresolved. The city did not greet her as she had imagined. It was loud, crowded, indifferent. At first, the anonymity thrilled her. No one knew where she came from. No one measured her against her parents or the land. She took whatever work she could find. She told herself it was temporary, that every compromise was a step toward something better. Months turned into years. Jobs changed, apartments shifted, relationships began with intensity and ended quietly. She learned the language of ambition and exhaustion, the constant calculation of rent, food, transportation, and debt. She stopped calling home altogether. At first it was because she was busy. Then it was because she did not know how to explain that she was no closer to the life she had promised herself. Each missed call made the next one harder. The farm became something she spoke about in the past tense, as if it belonged to a different person. When her parents sent occasional messages, she answered briefly, carefully, avoiding detail. She told herself she would call when she had something good to report. What she did not admit was how often she thought of the farm when things went wrong. In moments of exhaustion, she remembered the certainty of work that mattered. On the farm, effort always produced something tangible, even if it was small. In the city, she worked endlessly and felt no closer to stability. Still, pride kept her moving forward. Returning without success felt worse than continuing to fail in silence. The collapse came quietly, like everything else in her life by then. A job ended with a polite meeting and a stack of paperwork. Savings evaporated faster than she expected. The bank began calling. Friends grew distant when her optimism faltered. One evening, alone in a small apartment she could no longer afford, she realized that she had spent years running not toward a dream, but away from a fear. The city had not defeated her in some dramatic fashion. It had simply outlasted her illusions. She considered calling her parents that night. She picked up her phone, stared at their number, and put it down again. The shame felt heavier than the debt. In her mind, returning to the farm meant admitting that she had been wrong, that the escape she had needed so badly had not saved her. She convinced herself that they must be disappointed, that her absence had hardened into resentment. The thought allowed her to postpone the call, even as everything else in her life unraveled. It was then that a different idea began to take shape. She did not want to return home, but she could return to the land in her own way. Not as a daughter seeking refuge, but as a woman starting over on her own terms. The thought frightened her, but it also steadied her. Farming was not a fantasy to her. It was the one skill set she possessed that was not theoretical. She knew the risks, she knew the labor, and for the first time in years, she felt something close to clarity. By the end of that week, she had begun searching for land. The decision did not feel like hope. It felt like necessity. She did not tell her parents. She told no one. As she scanned listings late at night, the farm of her childhood lingered in her thoughts, not as a destination, but as a reminder of what endurance looked like. She did not know yet that the choice she was about to make would bind her future not only to the land, but to a past far larger and more dangerous than she could imagine. The decision to look for land did not come with relief. It came with a steady, almost mechanical resolve, the kind that followed panic once panic had exhausted itself. After years of improvising in the city, she found comfort in the clarity of search parameters and numbers. Acres, water access, distance from town, price. She made lists the way her mother once had, written in neat columns, as if order itself might hold things together. She told herself this was not a return, not an admission of defeat, but a redirection. The land would not be her parents' land. It would be hers, separate, earned through risk rather than inheritance. She searched late at night, sitting on the edge of her bed with a laptop balanced on her knees, the glow of the screen illuminating a room already half-packed. Listings blurred together at first. Some parcels were too expensive, polished and advertised with the optimism of people who had never worked the soil themselves. Others were cheap for obvious reasons, stripped of value by contamination, legal disputes, or sheer barrenness. Each listing felt like a possible future, and most of them ended the same way, with her closing the window and shaking her head. As the days passed, she began traveling outside the city to see land in person. She borrowed a car and drove through areas she had never bothered to explore before, places where development had stalled or retreated altogether. She met landowners who spoke with resignation about declining interest, about children who had moved away and never returned. In their voices, she heard echoes of her own parents, and the resemblance unsettled her. Still, she kept her distance, reminding herself that this was not nostalgia guiding her, but survival. The idea of returning to her parents' farm surfaced repeatedly, uninvited. It appeared in small moments, like when she calculated the cost of fencing or imagined the first winter without proper shelter. Each time she pushed it aside. She had built too much of her identity around leaving to allow herself the simplicity of going back. She believed, with a stubbornness she did not examine too closely, that her parents would see her return as a burden rather than a reunion. One afternoon, she came across a listing that felt wrong in its simplicity. The price was far lower than comparable land in the area, even accounting for its distance from town. The description was sparse. The acreage was generous. The soil, according to the brief report attached, was workable. And then there was the structure mentioned almost as an afterthought, an old water tower, no longer in use. She clicked through the few photographs available. The land looked ordinary enough, slightly overgrown but not neglected beyond recovery. The tower stood near the center of the property, tall and rusted, its cylindrical body casting a long shadow across the field. It dominated the image in a way that made her uneasy, as if the land itself had grown around it, rather than the other way around. She stared at the screen longer than she intended to. The next day, she drove out to see it. The road narrowed as she left the highway, the pavement giving way to gravel, then dirt. The landscape grew quieter, less shaped by human intention. When she finally reached the property, she parked at the edge of the field and stepped out of the car. The air was still, heavy with the scent of dry grass and metal warmed by the sun. The land stretched farther than it had appeared in the photographs, gently sloping in places, uneven but promising. The tower was more imposing in person. It rose from the ground with a solidity that suggested permanence, even in its decay. Rust streaked its surface, and vines had begun to creep up its base, but the structure itself remained intact. She circled it slowly, her boots crunching against gravel and weeds. There was something unsettling about it, not because it looked dangerous, but because it looked purposeful in a way that no longer made sense. She noticed the silence first. Birds skirted the area without landing near the tower. The wind shifted direction around it, as if diverted by an obstacle that refused to yield. She touched the metal briefly, half expecting it to vibrate or echo, but it was cold and still beneath her palm. Later that day, she spoke with a local man who lived a mile down the road. He leaned against his truck as he talked, his eyes never quite meeting hers. He told her the tower had been decommissioned decades earlier, that no one had ever bothered to remove it. He mentioned government ownership in passing, then shrugged and said paperwork had been lost or forgotten. People had tried to buy the land before, he said, but most walked away once they learned about the tower. Too much trouble. Too many questions. The words stayed with her as she drove back toward the city. Too much trouble had defined much of her adult life already. Questions no longer frightened her the way they once had. If anything, the complications made the land feel attainable. It was not pristine. It did not come with promises. It came with responsibility and uncertainty, things she understood. That night, she sat with the numbers spread out before her. Loan estimates, interest rates, monthly payments. The margin for error was narrow. One bad season could ruin her. She knew this. She also knew that waiting for certainty had brought her nothing but delay. When she signed the preliminary documents, her hand did not shake. The fear was there, but it had settled into something manageable, something she could work around. The weeks that followed were consumed by logistics. Paperwork passed back and forth. Inspections were conducted hastily, more concerned with liability than thoroughness. No one seemed particularly interested in the tower beyond noting its presence. It existed in the margins of every report, acknowledged but unexplored. When the sale was finalized, she felt neither triumph nor dread, only the strange calm that followed irreversible decisions. She moved onto the land with what little she owned. The first nights were the hardest. Without the constant noise of the city, her thoughts grew louder. The darkness was complete, unbroken by streetlights or passing cars. She lay awake, listening to unfamiliar sounds, reminding herself that she had chosen this. Each morning, she woke early and walked the boundaries of her property, learning its contours the way she once had as a child. The tower watched over everything. She avoided it at first, focusing instead on clearing a small area for temporary shelter and mapping out where future work would begin. Yet her gaze returned to it constantly. It felt like a question she had not yet learned how to ask. Standing alone in the field, she began to understand that buying the land had not simply given her a place to start over. It had placed her in the shadow of something unfinished, something waiting. As she worked, memories of her parents surfaced more frequently. Her father's insistence on inspecting structures carefully, her mother's habit of understanding a problem fully before addressing it. She wondered, briefly, what they would say about the tower. The thought made her pause, then continue working without answering it. By the end of her first week on the land, exhaustion had settled into her bones, but it was a familiar kind. It reminded her of seasons past, of days spent working until the body demanded rest. That familiarity gave her confidence. Whatever secrets the tower held, she believed she could face them. She did not yet realize that the tower was not simply a relic of neglected infrastructure, but the doorway to a history that would reach far beyond her land, far beyond her intentions, and draw her inexorably back toward the people she had been trying not to need. For several days after moving onto the land, she behaved as though the tower were simply another feature of the landscape, no different from a rocky outcrop or a line of old trees. She worked around it rather than toward it, clearing a small area for shelter, marking out where she might later build fencing, testing the soil with methods so ingrained that her hands remembered them without instruction. The work grounded her. Each evening she returned to her temporary shelter, exhausted in a way that felt earned, her muscles aching with a familiarity she had missed for years. Yet the tower never left her awareness. It stood at the center of the property, like a fixed point around which everything else revolved. No matter where she worked, it remained in her peripheral vision, its height and shape asserting themselves against the sky. At night, when the land disappeared into darkness, the tower remained visible as a darker silhouette against the stars. She told herself she would inspect it when she had more time, when the immediate demands of survival had been addressed. The excuse grew thinner with each passing day. What finally drove her toward it was not curiosity, but practicality. Water management would determine whether the land could support her plans. The tower, obsolete as it was, represented infrastructure. She needed to know its condition, its stability, its risks. Avoiding it no longer felt responsible. On the morning she decided to go inside, the air was cool and still, the kind of quiet that made every sound seem deliberate. She approached the base slowly, noting details she had overlooked before. The concrete foundation was solid, weathered, but intact. The metal ladder bolted to the side of the structure showed signs of age, but not neglect. Someone had maintained it long after the tower's supposed decommissioning. That realization unsettled her. She rested her hand on the first rung and felt the chill of metal seep into her skin. Climbing the ladder required focus. Each step echoed faintly within the hollow structure, a sound that seemed to travel farther than it should. As she ascended, the ground fell away beneath her, the field shrinking into a patchwork of dull greens and browns. The higher she climbed, the more aware she became of the tower's scale, of the way it enclosed space rather than simply occupying it. The hatch at the top resisted her at first. Rust clung to the hinges, and she had to brace herself to force it open. When it finally gave way, the sound rang out sharply, then faded into silence. She paused before climbing through, listening. Nothing answered her. She pulled herself up and into the interior. Inside, the air was cooler, carrying a faint metallic tang mixed with something older, harder to define. Light filtered in through narrow openings, illuminating dust that drifted slowly, undisturbed by any recent movement. The space felt preserved, as though it had been sealed against time rather than abandoned. She stood still, letting her eyes adjust, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The interior was more complex than she had expected. Pipes ran along the walls in deliberate patterns. Valves were arranged with a precision that suggested careful planning rather than improvisation. Some components bore markings she did not recognize, symbols and serial numbers that seemed out of place for a simple water tower. She moved cautiously, touching nothing at first, aware of how little she understood about what she was seeing. As she explored further, small inconsistencies began to emerge. Certain sections of the interior showed signs of modification, welding that did not match the original construction. Panels had been reinforced. Access points existed where none should have been necessary. The tower had not merely stored water. It had been adapted for another purpose, one that required secrecy and control. She felt a tightening in her chest, a mix of apprehension and reluctant excitement. The rational part of her mind urged caution, reminded her of the risks inherent in disturbing unknown structures. Another part, shaped by years of making decisions without safety nets, pressed her forward. She had bought the land. Whatever the tower contained, it was now her responsibility to understand it. The hidden compartment revealed itself gradually. She noticed a seam in the metal wall that did not align with the surrounding panels. It was subtle, easy to miss if one were not looking for it. She traced it with her fingers, feeling the slight irregularity beneath layers of paint and rust. After several minutes of careful inspection, she found a concealed latch. Opening the compartment took effort and patience. When it finally swung inward, she was greeted by the sight of several sealed containers stacked neatly inside. They were not improvised storage units, but purpose-built, their surfaces unmarked by corrosion. Alongside them lay folders encased in protective coverings, their contents shielded from moisture and decay. She did not touch anything immediately. The stillness of the space pressed in on her, heavy with implication. Whatever this was, it had been meant to last. It had been hidden deliberately, protected from both time and chance. Her initial thought was not of wealth or danger, but of scale. This was not the kind of thing left behind accidentally. When she finally examined the documents, she found technical diagrams, inventory lists, and references to materials she only partially understood. Certain terms stood out, familiar enough to suggest value, but obscure enough to resist easy interpretation. Rare metals, controlled components, serial numbers that implied tracking and accountability. The realization dawned slowly but firmly that this was not private property in any conventional sense. A wave of fear washed over her, sharp and disorienting. She imagined consequences unfolding beyond her control, imagined strangers arriving with authority she could not challenge. At the same time, another thought intruded, quieter but persistent. If she had not found this, someone else eventually would have. The tower had endured too long to remain unnoticed forever. She closed the compartment carefully, restoring it as best she could to its hidden state. As she descended the ladder, the land looked different to her. The field no longer felt empty or neutral. It felt watched, connected to something far beyond her plans. She worked the rest of the day in a distracted haze, her movements automatic, her thoughts circling the discovery she could not yet name. That evening, sitting alone as darkness settled over the land, she confronted the choice forming in her mind. She could attempt to profit from what she had found, sell pieces quietly, erase her debts, and disappear once more. The idea was tempting in its simplicity. It was also fragile, dependent on silence and luck she did not possess. The alternative was exposure. Questions, involvement with forces she had spent her adult life avoiding. Her parents' faces surfaced unbidden in her thoughts. Her father's insistence that shortcuts always cost more in the end. Her mother's belief that stability was built through patience rather than gambles. For years, she had measured herself against those values and found herself lacking. Now they returned as a kind of compass she had not realized she still carried. She did not make a final decision that night. Instead, she slept poorly, waking often to the imagined sound of footsteps near the tower. By morning, the fear had not vanished, but it had clarified. Whatever she chose, she would need help. Not financial help, but guidance and presence. The tower had bound her to a past she had tried to escape, and in doing so, it had begun to draw her back toward the very people she believed she could no longer face. After the night she spent half awake, listening to the imagined sounds of movement across her land, the tower no longer felt like an object she had discovered. It felt like something that had been waiting. Morning light did little to soften that impression. The field looked the same, the soil unchanged, the wind moving through dry grass with familiar indifference. Yet beneath that surface calm, she sensed a pressure she could not name. The knowledge of what lay inside the tower altered the land itself, turning open space into a place of consequence. She tried to resume her work as if nothing had happened. She repaired a section of fencing near the boundary line, checked the small garden beds she had begun preparing, and made notes about water distribution she would need once the season changed. Her body moved with practiced efficiency, but her attention drifted constantly. Every distant engine sound made her pause. Every unfamiliar shape on the horizon drew her gaze. The tower stood silent, offering no hint of how long it had truly been abandoned, or whether abandonment had ever been complete. The first sign that she was no longer alone came in the form of questions that were too carefully framed to be casual. A man stopped by one afternoon, claiming to be from a regional utilities office. He asked about the tower, about whether she planned to dismantle it, about whether she had noticed any structural issues. His tone was polite, professional, but his eyes lingered too long on her face, as if measuring her responses rather than listening to them. When he left, she realized he had not taken notes, had not asked for documentation, had not given her a card. After that, the interruptions multiplied. A vehicle she did not recognize parked briefly on the dirt road bordering her property and drove away when she approached. Someone called her phone asking questions about the land purchase, questions she had already answered during the sale. None of it was overtly threatening. That, she realized, was what made it worse. Whoever was paying attention to her did not need to rush. Her fear shifted from acute panic to something steadier and more corrosive. She understood now that the discovery inside the tower was not dormant. It was active, connected to systems that continued to operate long after the original purpose had been buried. She considered calling a lawyer, then dismissed the idea. She did not yet know what kind of situation she was in, and ignorance felt like vulnerability. When the agents arrived, they did not do so unannounced. She received a call requesting a meeting, their identities stated plainly, their authority unmistakable. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The words settled heavily in her chest. She agreed to meet them on the property, her voice steadier than she felt. They came the following morning, 2 of them, dressed in unremarkable clothing that blended easily into rural surroundings. They introduced themselves formally, their manner calm, almost reassuring. They asked permission to walk the land, permission to speak with her about the tower. She granted both, aware that refusal would accomplish little beyond escalating matters. The conversation unfolded slowly. They spoke of records, of infrastructure oversight, of discrepancies dating back decades. The tower, they explained, had once been part of a broader network tied to federal operations that no longer existed in any official capacity. Its continued presence on private land was an anomaly that had gone unresolved due to administrative oversight. They did not accuse her of wrongdoing. They did not reveal how much they knew. They asked questions and watched her carefully as she answered. She chose honesty, though not complete disclosure. She acknowledged entering the tower. She described what she had seen in general terms, withholding specifics she herself did not yet fully understand. The agents listened without interruption. When she finished, one of them nodded slightly, as if confirming an expectation rather than learning something new. They told her an investigation was ongoing. They told her cooperation would be necessary. They told her, without stating it directly, that her life had intersected with something far larger than her land or her plans. When they left, they assured her she would be contacted again soon. The word soon echoed unpleasantly in her thoughts, long after their vehicle disappeared down the road. In the hours that followed, she felt the full weight of her isolation. The land that had once promised independence now felt exposed. The credit she carried, the fragile beginnings of her farm, the tower itself, all seemed suddenly precarious. For the first time since leaving the city, she understood that this situation could not be managed alone. Pride, which had sustained her through years of quiet failure, offered no solution here. That night, she sat with her phone in her hands for a long time before making the call she had avoided for years. When her mother answered, there was no surprise in her voice, only recognition. The sound of it broke something open inside her. Words came slowly at first, awkward and incomplete. She did not explain everything. She did not apologize. She simply said that she was in trouble and that she needed help. There was a pause. Then her mother said she and her father would come the next morning. They arrived early, their truck pulling into the field, with a familiarity that made the land feel different at once. Her father stepped out first, his posture unchanged by time. Her mother followed, already scanning the surroundings, her eyes taking in details she herself had overlooked. There were no accusations, no questions about why she had waited so long. They embraced her briefly, firmly, as if anchoring her in place. Over the next days, their presence transformed the situation. Her father examined the tower with careful attention, noting the same inconsistencies she had seen, but with a practiced eye. He did not speculate aloud, did not express fear. He treated it as a problem to be understood before it could be addressed. Her mother organized the household she had barely established, creating order where there had been only improvisation. When the agents returned, they found her no longer alone. Her parents did not interfere, but they didn't retreat either. They listened, asked questions, requested clarification. The balance of the interaction shifted subtly. The investigation continued, but it no longer unfolded entirely on terms beyond her control. At night, sitting at the small table they shared, she began to understand the depth of her mistake in believing her parents' love had been conditional. They didn't speak of the years she had been gone. They didn't ask her to explain herself. Their support was not dramatic or sentimental. It was practical, steady, and complete. As the days passed, she realized that the tower had done more than expose her to danger. It had stripped away the last excuse she had clung to for remaining distant. Whatever the outcome of the investigation, whatever consequences followed, she was no longer facing them alone. The land, the tower, and the people she had once fled were now bound together, shaping a future she could no longer pretend was hers to navigate in isolation. Once her parents had settled into the rhythms of the land, the days began to take on a different texture. The tension did not disappear, but it changed shape. It was no longer the sharp, solitary fear she had carried since discovering the hidden compartment inside the tower. Instead, it became something shared, distributed across conversations, glances, and quiet decisions made together. The investigation moved forward with a steadiness that was both reassuring and exhausting, and she found herself caught between waiting and acting, between the life she was trying to build and the forces that had intruded upon it. The agents returned frequently. Sometimes they came with questions that circled the same points from different angles, testing consistency, patience, and honesty. Other times they came simply to observe, to walk the land again, to revisit the tower with equipment and specialists whose presence made the structure feel less like a relic and more like an active site. She cooperated fully, answering what she could, admitting what she did not know. Each interaction drained her, yet she sensed that withholding information would only prolong the uncertainty. The process was slow by design. Paperwork accumulated. Timelines were reconstructed from fragments of records and memories. The contents of the tower were cataloged and analyzed, their significance clarified piece by piece. She learned gradually that what she had found was not merely valuable in monetary terms, but sensitive in ways that extended far beyond her personal circumstances. The materials had been tied to programs long dissolved, their oversight lost amid shifting priorities and deliberate obscurity. What remained was a legal and moral tangle that could not be resolved quickly or quietly. Throughout it all, her parents maintained their quiet presence. Her father spent his mornings repairing equipment and assessing the land, as if asserting continuity in the face of disruption. He spoke little about the investigation, but when he did, his questions were precise, his comments grounded in experience rather than fear. Her mother took charge of daily life, ensuring that meals happened at regular intervals, that basic comforts were not neglected. In their routines, she found a sense of stability she had not known she was missing. In the evenings, when the work of the day was done, they sat together and talked in ways they had not before. Not about accusations or regrets, but about practical matters, shared memories, and the realities of starting over. Her parents did not frame her return as a correction or a failure. They treated it as a continuation, a different phase of a life that had not ended when she left. As the investigation progressed, she was presented with choices that tested her in ways she had not anticipated. There were moments when cooperation felt like surrender, when the slow pace and lack of clear outcomes stirred resentment. She wondered, privately, what would have happened had she chosen a different path, had she attempted to profit quietly from her discovery. The thought no longer tempted her, but it lingered as a measure of what she had given up in choosing transparency. Those moments were tempered by clarity. Each time doubt surfaced, it was met by the knowledge that secrecy would have bound her to the tower in ways far more destructive than any investigation. She saw, with growing certainty, that honesty had not only protected her legally, but preserved something essential within her. She was no longer improvising survival. She was standing within it, exposed but intact. The resolution came without fanfare. One afternoon, the agent sat with her and her parents at the small table in the temporary shelter and explained the outcome of their work. The materials found within the tower were confirmed to be part of a closed federal case. Their continued concealment, the result of negligence rather than intent. Her cooperation had allowed the matter to be addressed without escalation. There would be no charges, no seizure of her land. The tower itself would be formally decommissioned under supervision, its contents removed and documented. There was also, they explained, a provision for compensation, not a reward in the celebratory sense, but a formal acknowledgement of her role in preserving materials of significance and in preventing potential misuse. The amount was substantial enough to alter the trajectory of her life, though it came wrapped in conditions and oversight that reflected the seriousness of the matter. When the agents left, the silence that followed felt different from those she had known before. It was not heavy with fear or uncertainty. It was reflective, almost reverent. She sat with the knowledge that her debts could be cleared, that the land could be developed without the shadow of financial collapse. The realization did not bring the exhilaration she might once have imagined. Instead, it brought a quiet sense of alignment. That night, she spoke openly with her parents in a way she had avoided for years. She acknowledged her fear of returning, her belief that she had disappointed them. Her father listened, his expression thoughtful. Her mother reached for her hand and held it, steady and warm. They told her, simply, that they had never measured her worth by her proximity or her success. They had waited because they believed she would come back when she was ready, in whatever way she chose. The words settled into her with unexpected weight. She understood then that the reckoning she had feared was not one of judgment, but of truth. She had not needed to prove herself worthy of belonging. She had only needed to allow herself to be seen. In the days that followed, the practical implications of the resolution began to take shape. Loans were renegotiated, then paid off. Plans she had sketched in uncertainty gained definition. The land felt lighter, no longer burdened by secrets that did not belong to it. The tower, though still standing, had lost its power over her imagination. It was no longer a threat or a temptation. It was a structure with a history that had been acknowledged and contained. As she walked the fields with her father one morning, discussing crop rotation and water access, she realized that the most significant change had not come from financial relief or legal closure. It had come from her willingness to stop running, to confront both her past and her present without disguise. The choices she made now were not reactions to fear, but commitments to a life she was prepared to sustain. The reckoning had not undone her mistakes, but it had placed them in context. They were part of a larger narrative, one that did not end with failure or success, but with understanding. And as she stood on the land she had chosen, surrounded by the people she had once believed she could not face, she sensed that the future unfolding before her was not a reward, but a responsibility she was finally ready to accept. Time did not transform the land all at once. It worked slowly, in increments so small that they were noticeable only when she stopped to look back. Weeks passed, then months, and the sharp intensity that had defined the early days after the investigation faded into something steadier. The land absorbed the changes quietly, as it always had. Grass grew where it had been cleared. Fences settled into place. Paths formed beneath repeated footsteps. The farm began to take shape, not as an idea, but as a living system responding to care and attention. The tower remained standing throughout that process, but its presence changed. After the federal work was completed and its contents removed, it was no longer a sealed question. Inspectors came, engineers assessed its structure, and official documentation was filed. What had once been a source of anxiety became a matter of logistics. The tower was reinforced where necessary, stripped of its hidden compartments, and reclassified for a new, legitimate purpose. Its transformation was gradual, mirroring her own. With the financial burden lifted, she was able to make decisions without desperation. She invested carefully, prioritizing sustainability over expansion. Water systems were installed and tested. Soil was enriched through methods she had learned long ago and refined through observation. She did not rush. She remembered too clearly what haste had cost her in the past. Each improvement was deliberate, chosen for longevity rather than appearance. Her parents remained on the land, not as overseers, but as collaborators. Her father worked alongside her, his presence a constant but unobtrusive guide. He offered advice when asked, shared experience without insisting upon it. Her mother brought a sense of continuity that extended beyond labor. She marked time through meals, through the rhythm of days that felt both familiar and newly claimed. Together, they formed a household not defined by obligation, but by shared purpose. The tower's new role emerged naturally from the needs of the farm. It was converted into a functioning water storage and distribution point, integrated into a broader system that relied on efficiency rather than excess. Solar panels were installed nearby, their quiet operation a counterpoint to the tower's industrial past. What had once represented secrecy and danger now served transparency and stability. The structure itself did not change its outward appearance dramatically, but its meaning shifted entirely. As seasons turned, the land responded. Crops took hold. The soil retained moisture more effectively. The work was demanding, but it no longer felt like punishment or penance. It felt like participation in something larger than her individual ambition. She found herself measuring success not by speed or scale, but by balance. There were days when progress was invisible, when effort yielded little immediate reward. She learned to accept those days as part of the cycle, rather than evidence of failure. Her relationship with her parents settled into a quiet equilibrium. They did not speak often about the years she had spent away. The absence no longer demanded explanation. In its place grew a mutual respect, shaped by experience rather than expectation. They trusted her judgment, and she trusted herself enough to accept their guidance without resentment. The past, once a source of shame, became simply another layer of shared history. Occasionally, she thought of the city, not with bitterness or longing, but with a detached understanding. It had been a necessary chapter, one that had taught her limits she might never have learned otherwise. She no longer framed her departure as a mistake, or her return as a retreat. Both had been movements toward clarity, even if the path between them had been painful. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the fields, she stood near the base of the tower and watched its shadow stretch across the land. It no longer felt imposing. It belonged to the landscape now, integrated rather than dominant. She realized that fear had never resided in the structure itself. It had lived in uncertainty, in the refusal to confront what lay hidden. Once exposed and addressed, the tower lost its power to intimidate. The farm began to draw quiet attention from others in the area. Not curiosity, but respect. Neighbors stopped by to ask questions, to share advice, to offer help. She did not advertise her story, and few knew its full extent. That privacy felt appropriate. The land did not need spectacle, it needed stewardship. In moments of stillness, she reflected on how close she had come to choosing a different path when she first discovered the hidden compartment. The memory no longer frightened her. It reminded her of the values she had returned to, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. Honesty had not been the easiest choice. It had been the one that allowed her to remain whole. Her parents eventually spoke of returning to their own farm, of resuming the life they had never abandoned. The idea no longer filled her with dread. She knew now that separation did not equate to loss. They would remain connected by more than proximity. When the time came, she helped them prepare. their departure marked not by absence, but by continuity. On the morning they left, she watched their truck disappear down the same road she had once driven away on, burdened by uncertainty. The memory no longer stung. She understood now that leaving and staying were not opposites, but parts of the same movement through life. What mattered was not where one stood, but how fully one inhabited that place. As dusk settled, she returned to the tower one last time that day, resting her hand against its surface. The metal was warm from the sun, solid, ordinary. It stood not as a monument to secrecy, but as evidence of adaptation. The land stretched around it, alive and responsive, shaped by effort rather than fear. She turned away and walked back toward the house, confident in the knowledge that she was no longer running from her past or chasing a version of herself defined by escape. She was living within the balance she had sought all along, grounded in work that mattered, supported by love that had never wavered, and guided by a clarity earned through endurance. The tower no longer inspired fear because it no longer held power over her. It was simply part of the landscape she had chosen, and the life she was prepared to sustain. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Watch the following videos and explore other stories already on the channel. If this video resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to see it.